I still hear the shutter click, that single, mechanical sound that sliced through the silence right after she said it. The air backstage at the gala always smells the same. Burnt hairspray, expensive champagne, and desperate ambition. But that night, the scent was sharper, edged with something dangerous. I had my camera, my shield against the beautiful people, but it wasn't enough to protect me from her. One career-defining gig. One rule. Don't touch the talent. I broke it before the fireworks even started. But to understand the ruin, you have to see the perfection that came before it. Photography is an act of aggressive observation. You take the world, chaotic and messy, and you force it into a rectangle of perfect order. I've built my entire reputation on that control. They call me when they want the truth to look like a dream, when they need the lighting to forgive sins and the shadows to hide secrets. Tonight was the pinnacle of that curated reality. The New Year's Eve fashion gala. The biggest night in the industry, a swirling vortex of ego and silk. The backstage area was a war zone disguised as a dressing room. Assistants screamed into headsets, their voices rising in panic over missing shoes and fallen hems. Makeup artists wielded brushes like scalpels, carving cheekbones out of exhaustion. The lights were blinding. Hot, white banks of LEDs that bleached the color out of everything not directly in their path. It was a sensory assault, a wall of noise and heat that usually made me retreat behind my lens. I checked my ISO settings for the third time in 2 minutes. 800. Fast shutter. The aperture wide enough to blur out the madness, keeping the focus razor sharp on the subject. My camera is heavy, a solid weight in my hands that grounds me when the air gets too thin. But tonight, the barrier felt thin. My hands, usually steady as stone, had a tremor I couldn't quite suppress. I blame the caffeine. I blame the pressure of the client, a magazine editor who could end careers with a single arched eyebrow. But the truth was simpler. I was waiting for her, Rachel. The name alone was enough to change the temperature in the room. She wasn't just a model. She was an industry unto herself. I'd studied her portfolio for weeks, memorizing the angles of her face, the way light caught the sharp line of her jaw, the specific, heavy-lidded gaze she used to dismantle photographers. I told myself it was preparation. I told myself I needed to know her face to light it properly. But looking at those glossy prints late at night, in the quiet of my studio, felt less like homework and more like an obsession taking root. I adjusted a strobe light, moving it 3 inches to the left. Precision is the only defense against chaos. If the light is right, nothing else matters. I focused on the technical details, the sync speed, the battery levels, the memory cards, empty and waiting to be filled. I built a fortress out of specifications and settings, trying to wall off the nervous flutter in my chest. The room was filled with beautiful women, tall, ethereal creatures who moved with the grace of gazelles and the hunger of wolves. I photographed them mechanically. Click, turn, click, chin down, click. It was easy work. They knew the dance, and I knew the rhythm. But it felt hollow. I was going through the motions, my eyes constantly darting toward the main entrance, the heavy velvet curtains that separated the backstage madness from the VIP arrival area. Every time the curtain twitched, my breath hitched. It was unprofessional. It was distracting. I forced myself to look at the histogram on my screen, analyzing the exposure curve. Too much contrast. I dialed it down. I checked the white balance. I was drowning in the technicalities because the alternative was admitting that I was terrified. Not of failing the job, but of meeting her. Of seeing if the reality could possibly match the image burned into my mind. The noise in the room reached a fever pitch. A designer was screaming about a zipper. A tray of champagne glasses shattered, the sound bright and violent against the concrete floor. And then it happened. The heavy velvet curtains swept open. The air didn't just change, it stopped. The shouting died in throats. The frantic motion froze. It was as if someone had sucked all the oxygen out of the room, leaving us suspended in a vacuum of sudden, terrified reverence. Rachel didn't just walk into a room. She occurred. It was an event, a shift in atmospheric pressure that popped your ears. She swept through the velvet curtains, wrapped in a silk robe the color of midnight, her entourage trailing behind her like the debris of a comet. The first thing I noticed wasn't her face. I knew her face better than my own reflection by now, but the way she carried the silence with her. The frantic shouting of the backstage area died instantly, strangled by the sheer force of her presence. She moved with a languid, predatory grace, indifferent to the chaos she caused. It was the walk of a woman who knew that the world would wait for her, that time itself would slow down to accommodate her pace. I lifted my camera. It was a reflex, a desperate need to put a filter between me and the raw voltage she was generating. I framed her in the viewfinder, adjusting the focus ring with trembling fingers. Through the lens, she was just an image, a collection of pixels and light. Manageable, safe. I pressed the shutter button. Click. The sound was a gunshot in the quiet room. And that's when she stopped. She didn't look at the stylist rushing toward her with brushes and sprays. She didn't look at the gala director, hyperventilating near the wardrobe rack. She turned her head slowly, deliberately, and looked straight down the barrel of my lens. Usually, when a model looks at the camera, she is looking at a reflection of herself. She is projecting an idea. Rachel wasn't projecting anything. She was seeing. Her gaze cut through the glass elements, through the aperture blades, and pinned me against the back wall of my own skull. It was an unflinching, intelligent stare that stripped away my professional armor. I felt exposed, caught in the act of stealing something I hadn't earned. I lowered the camera slowly, letting the strap dig into my neck. I needed to see if the intensity was a trick of the glass. It wasn't. "Clear the floor," I barked, my voice sounding thin and overly loud in the hush. I needed noise. I needed motion. I needed to be the director again. "Lights up on Mark 1. Let's get a test shot before she changes." My assistant scrambled, grateful for the command. But Rachel didn't move toward the changing screen. She ignored her agent, who was whispering frantically about the schedule. She ignored the hairstylist, reaching for a stray lock. She simply started walking toward me. The crowd parted for her like the Red Sea. I stood my ground, gripping the rubberized body of my camera until my knuckles turned white. She stopped 2 feet away from me. It was a violation of the unwritten rules. The talent stays on the mark, the photographer stays behind the line. But Rachel didn't care about lines. Up close, the poreless skin and architectural bone structure caught the overhead lights, while her dark, heavy eyes seemed to hold a challenge. Then the scent hit me. It wasn't the floral, powdery perfume I expected. It was something deeper: oud, burnt cedar, and the sharp metallic tang of winter air clinging to her skin. It cut through the artificial sweetness of hairspray and cheap champagne, smelling of dark forests and expensive secrets. It made my head swim. "You're the one," she said. Her voice was low, a rich contralto that vibrated in my chest. It wasn't a question. "I'm the photographer," I managed to say. My throat felt like it was filled with sand. "We have a tight schedule, Rachel. If you could—" "You're the one who shoots shadows," she interrupted, taking a step closer. She was in my personal space now, breathing my air. She looked down at my hands, still white-knuckled on the camera body. A slow, knowing smile touched the corner of her mouth. "You hold that camera like it's the only thing keeping you upright." She reached out, her fingers cool and dry, and brushed the back of my hand. The contact was electric, a sudden jolt that traveled up my arm and settled heavy in my stomach. She wasn't looking at my face anymore. She was studying the tension in my grip. "Your hands are shaking," she whispered, her voice dropping to a level that excluded the rest of the room. "Are you nervous, photographer? Or just hungry?" "I'm precise," I lied, pulling my hand back as if she'd burned me. "I'm focused on the light." "Liar," she murmured, the words soft as a caress. "You're focused on me." She held my gaze for 1 second longer, a second that stretched out into an eternity of heat and recognition, before turning on her heel. "Let's shoot," she threw over her shoulder, dropping the robe to the floor in a puddle of dark silk. "Before you forget how to breathe entirely." The session began not with a word, but with the sharp whine of capacitors charging. I raised the camera, and the world narrowed down to the rectangular frame of the viewfinder. Photography is an act of translation. You are taking the three-dimensional reality of a woman and flattening her into 2 dimensions, hoping that in the process you don't lose the soul. With Rachel, the translation was violent. She didn't just stand there, she struck the air. The shutter clicked, a mechanical heartbeat that set the rhythm for the entire room. Flash. She turned. Flash. She tilted her head. Flash. She offered me the long, elegant line of her throat. I usually have to guide a model through the geometry of a shoot. I have to tell them where the light falls, how to catch the rim light with their cheekbone, how to elongate the torso. With Rachel, commands were redundant. She felt the light on her skin like a physical touch. If a shadow fell across her eye, she shifted a millimeter to the right, clearing it, before I could even open my mouth. It was a silent conversation, conducted in the language of angles and aperture. I would shift my weight, and she would mirror the tension. I would crouch low to exaggerate her height, and she would look down at me with an imperious, icy disdain that the camera absolutely devoured. I focused on the texture of what I was capturing. The lens magnified everything. I saw the way the muscles in her forearm tightened as she gripped the fabric of her dress, a hidden strain that betrayed the effort behind the grace. I saw the pulse beating frantically at the base of her neck, a tiny rhythmic flutter that contradicted the ice in her expression. I saw the way her pupils were blown wide, swallowing the light. It was intoxicating. I was dissecting her, piece by piece, reducing her to a series of perfect, isolated components. The arch of a brow, the curve of a lip, the sharp, dangerous point of a shoulder blade. Then, the rhythm broke. I pressed the shutter, but the main key light didn't fire. The room remained dim, the image in my viewfinder muddy and gray. The sync cord had worked itself loose. It was a rookie mistake, a technical failure that severed the connection between us instantly. "Hold," I said, the word sounding harsh in the sudden silence. The assistants started to move, but I waved them off. I needed to do this myself. I needed to reset the energy. I walked onto the white seamless paper, entering the circle of heat where she stood. The temperature under the modeling lights was 10 degrees hotter than the rest of the room. It smelled of ozone and hot metal. Rachel didn't break her pose. She remained frozen, her back twisted, her arms raised, a statue of flesh and blood waiting for animation. I knelt at the base of the light stand, my hands working quickly to reseat the cable. I was close enough to hear the fabric of her dress rustle as she breathed. I was close enough to feel the heat radiating off her legs. "It's all fake, isn't it?" Her voice was barely a whisper, dropping down from above me. I paused, my hand still on the cable. I looked up. From this angle, she was a giantess, looming and distorted, but her face was turned away from the lights, cast in shadow. "The light?" I asked, standing up slowly. I was inches from her now. The proximity was dizzying. "The perfection," she murmured. She turned her head, looking at the dark studio beyond the lights, her guard completely down for the first time. "They polish us until we're just mirrors. They don't want a person. They want a surface." She looked at me then, and the hunger in her eyes was so raw it felt like a physical blow. "You're looking for the cracks, aren't you? That's why your hands shake. You want to see what's underneath." She didn't wait for an answer. She simply exhaled, a long, shuddering breath that slumped her perfect posture into something tired and infinitely more beautiful. I didn't step back to the safety of my line. I didn't check the meter. I just lifted the camera, right there in her space, and took the shot. No flash, no filter, just the grain of the high ISO and the truth of a woman unraveling. The green room was a windowless box, painted a color that didn't exist in nature, somewhere between sterile beige and calming taupe. It was designed to be a vacuum, a place where the frantic energy of the production could be sucked away, leaving only silence and air conditioning. I retreated there not because I was done, but because I was vibrating. My skin felt too tight, stretched thin over nerves that were firing in erratic, panicked bursts. I needed the dark. I needed the safety of my laptop screen and the illusion that I was still the one in control. I set the camera down on the designated workstation table with a deliberate, heavy thud. The tethering cable snaked across the surface like a lifeline. I sat, exhaling a breath I felt like I'd been holding for 20 minutes, and opened the capture folder. The images populated the grid, row after row of high-resolution perfection. Rachel, looking imperious. Rachel, looking ethereal. Rachel, looking like a goddess who had briefly descended to judge the mortals. They were technically flawless. The lighting was crisp, the shadows falling exactly where I had commanded them to fall. But my cursor hovered over the last file, the one I had taken without the flash, the one where she had unraveled. I double-clicked it. The image filled the screen, raw and grainy and devastating. In the photo, her head was turned, the tendons in her neck standing out in sharp relief. Her eyes weren't looking at the lens. They were looking through it, wide and dark and filled with an exhaustion so profound it made my own bones ache. It wasn't a fashion photograph. It was a confession. I was so lost in the topography of her face on the screen, tracing the pixelated curve of her lower lip with my eyes, that I didn't hear the door open. I only knew she was there because the air in the room suddenly felt heavier, charged with that same static electricity that had shorted out my equipment earlier. "Leave us," she said. Her voice was calm, but it carried the weight of absolute authority. I spun the chair around. Rachel stood in the doorway, one hand on the handle, the other dismissing a wall of security guards and publicists who looked like they wanted to argue but knew better. She was still wearing the silk robe, but it was loosened now, revealing the sharp architecture of her collarbone. She waited until the last suit had retreated and the door clicked shut, sealing us in. Then she turned the lock. The sound was small, but it echoed in the silence like a dropped coin. "You're hiding," she said, pushing off the door frame and walking toward me. She didn't walk like a model now. She walked like a predator, stalking prey in a cage. "I'm editing," I corrected, though my voice lacked conviction. "I have to deliver the selects within the hour." "You're hiding," she repeated, coming to a stop directly behind my chair. She didn't come around to face me. She stayed back there, in my blind spot, her presence a tangible heat against my back. I could smell her again, that woody, sharp scent of cedar and expensive secrets. It was overwhelming in the small room. "Show me." I didn't have to ask what she meant. I turned back to the monitor, my hand hovering over the trackpad. I should have closed the file. I should have switched back to the glossy, safe images that would end up on the cover. But I didn't. I left the raw file open, a glowing testament to the moment she had let the mask slip. Rachel leaned over my shoulder, her hair, loose and dark, brushed against my cheek, a soft, shocking friction that made my breath hitch. She placed one hand on the desk, right next to mine. Her fingers were long, manicured to a lethal point, rings clicking softly against the laminate. "That's not the supermodel," she whispered, her breath warm against my ear. She was studying her own image with a detached, clinical fascination. "That's just the girl who's tired of being looked at." "It's the best shot of the night," I admitted, the truth slipping out before I could check it. "It's dangerous," she murmured. She shifted her weight, leaning closer until her arm pressed against my shoulder. The contact was firm, undeniable. "You have a dangerous eye, photographer. You see things you aren't supposed to see." She lifted her hand from the desk and, with agonizing slowness, reached out to the screen. She didn't touch the glass. She hovered her finger over the image of her own throat, tracing the line of vulnerability I had captured. Then her hand drifted back, not to the desk, but to my hand resting on the mouse. Her fingertips grazed my knuckles, light as ash. "Your hands," she said softly, her voice dropping an octave. "They aren't shaking now." I looked down. Under her touch, my hand was perfectly still. "I'm working. I don't shake when I'm working." "Liar," she teased, the word vibrating with a low, sultry humor. Her finger traced the vein on the back of my hand, a slow, deliberate line that felt like it was burning through my skin. "You're steady because you think you're safe in here." She leaned down further, her lips inches from my ear. "But there's no camera between us right now." I couldn't breathe. The air in the room had been replaced by her. "Rachel, the gala starts in 20 minutes. You need to be—" "I hate New Year's Eve," she interrupted, straightening up but not stepping away. She kept her hand on mine, pinning me to the moment. The forced celebration, The desperate need for everything to be different just because the clock changes. Everyone wants a resolution. They want to promise they'll be better, thinner, richer. She looked at the screen again, at the exhausted woman I had captured. I don't want to be better. I just want to be real. For 5 minutes. She squeezed my hand, a quick, hard pressure that felt like a code I didn't have the cipher for yet. That's why I came in here, to find the only person in the building who saw me. The moment stretched, taut as a violin string, ready to snap. I turned my hand over beneath hers, interlacing our fingers. It was a risk. It was unprofessional. It was inevitable. Her skin was cool, her grip surprisingly strong. Then a sharp rap on the door shattered the world. "Miss Rachel!" A handler's voice, muffled but frantic. 5 minutes to curtain. We need you in wardrobe now." Rachel closed her eyes, a flicker of pain crossing her face. She pulled her hand away, the loss of contact leaving a cold ache in my palm. She was the supermodel again, before she even turned around, the armor sliding back into place. "Don't delete it," she commanded, looking at me one last time. "The photo. Keep it. It's the only honest thing that's happened tonight." And then she was gone, leaving the room colder and infinitely emptier than before. The ballroom was a different kind of violence. If backstage was a war zone, this was the victory parade. Loud, glittering, and suffocatingly triumphant. I slipped into the main hall like a shadow, trading the sterile silence of the green room for a wall of sound that hit me in the chest. 1,000 crystal glasses clinking, the low roar of polite conversation, the swell of a string quartet fighting a losing battle against the ambient noise of wealth. I was back in my role, the invisible observer in black, drifting along the edges of the room with my camera raised, documenting the excess. I found her immediately. You didn't have to look for Rachel. You just looked for where the light seemed to bend. She was standing near the center of the room, surrounded by a phalanx of donors in tuxedos and industry titans who looked at her like she was an acquisition they were considering. She had changed into a gown of liquid silver that clung to her like a second skin, reflecting every flashbulb that popped in her direction. She was a statue of perfection, a masterclass in public performance. I watched her through my telephoto lens from 30 feet away. It was a strange, masochistic form of voyeurism. I watched her throw her head back and laugh at a joke that I knew wasn't funny. I watched her place a hand on the arm of a studio head, her touch light and charming, the exact opposite of the heavy, grounding grip she had used on me just minutes ago. She was radiant. She was magnetic. And she was completely, utterly fake. A pang of jealousy twisted in my gut. She belonged to everyone else right now. A commodity to be consumed by the eyes of every man and woman in the room. They saw the gloss. I knew the crack in her voice. Instead, I took photos. I circled the perimeter, a hunter looking for an opening. Every time the crowd shifted, I caught glimpses of her. And then it happened. She was in the middle of a conversation with a famous director, nodding politely, when her eyes lifted. She didn't scan the room. She didn't search. Our eyes met across the ocean of tuxedos and sequins. The connection was instantaneous. A taut line pulled tight over the heads of the oblivious crowd. She didn't smile. She didn't wave. She simply held my gaze for a fraction of a second, her expression shifting from radiant engagement to a flat, bored stillness. It was a secret signal. In that split second, the mask dropped, revealing a desperate, pleading exhaustion. I raised my camera and fired a burst of shots. Click, click, click. I wasn't capturing the glamour now. I was stealing the truth. I caught the way her smile didn't reach her eyes. I caught the tension in her jaw as she listened to another compliment. I caught the way her hand gripped the stem of her champagne flute, not delicately, but with a white-knuckled intensity that mirrored how I held my camera. These were the photos that would never run in the magazine. They were the photos I would keep for myself. Evidence that the woman in the green room hadn't been a hallucination. The energy in the room began to shift. The ambient noise grew louder, more frantic. The waiters were circulating with fresh trays of champagne. The string quartet had been replaced by a DJ, the bass thumping a low, rhythmic heartbeat into the floor. The countdown was approaching. You could feel the collective anxiety rising, the desperate need to be kissing the right person, holding the right drink, standing in the right light when the clock struck 12. It was a fever. Rachel was trapped. The circle around her had tightened, the admirers pressing in closer, feeding off her light. She looked like a bird in a gilded cage, beautiful and suffocating. I saw her glance at her phone, a quick, surreptitious movement hidden behind her clutch. A second later, my own phone buzzed against my hip. I pulled it out, shielding the screen from the glare of the chandeliers. A single message. No name, just a number I had saved 10 minutes ago. Get me out of here. I looked up. She was looking at me again, her eyebrow raised in a silent, imperious challenge. The plea in her eyes was gone, replaced by a reckless, dangerous spark. She wasn't asking for a rescue. She was demanding an accomplice. I shoved the phone back into my pocket, the metal cold against my palm. I didn't hesitate. I didn't think about the client or the shot list or the career suicide of kidnapping the star of the evening minutes before midnight. I just adjusted my strap, checked my exit route, and started moving through the crowd, cutting a path toward her with a singular, terrifying purpose. The ballroom was a kaleidoscope of noise, but I moved through it with the singular focus of a bullet. I didn't look back to see if she was following. I didn't have to. I could feel her presence behind me, a gravitational pull dragging through the wake I cut in the crowd. The service exit was hidden behind a towering arrangement of white lilies, a nondescript beige door that promised nothing but utility. I pushed it open, the heavy steel bar cold under my palm, and held it just long enough for a flash of silver silk to slip through before letting it slam shut. The silence was instant and violent. The roar of the gala was decapitated, replaced by the hum of industrial ventilation and the harsh buzz of fluorescent tubes. We were in the arteries of the building now, the ugly, functional, concrete throat that swallowed the glamorous production whole. "The elevator is this way," I said. My voice sounded too loud in the narrow corridor. Rachel didn't answer. She was walking beside me, her heels clicking a sharp staccato rhythm on the linoleum. She had shed the public mask the moment the door closed. Her shoulders had dropped 2 inches. The polite, frozen smile was gone, replaced by a look of fierce, concentrated relief. She looked less like a deity and more like a fugitive. I hit the call button for the freight elevator. The doors rattled open with a groan of protesting metal. We stepped inside. The car was massive, scarred with the scratches of 1,000 deliveries, smelling of grease and old dust. I hit the button for the roof. The doors rumbled shut, sealing us in a box that felt suddenly, terrifyingly small. The air charged between us. It wasn't the frantic energy of the ballroom or the professional tension of the studio. It was something heavier. Intimacy. We were alone, suspended in a shaft of darkness, moving upward. I leaned against the scuffed metal wall, watching her. She stood in the center of the car, her head tipped back, eyes closed, exposing the long, elegant line of her throat to the harsh overhead light. "You're crazy," I murmured. The words felt inadequate. "I'm suffocating," she corrected without opening her eyes. She took a deep breath, inhaling the stale air like it was mountain oxygen. "Do you know how many people have touched my arm in the last hour? How many people have told me I look radiant while staring at my chest?" She opened her eyes then, turning that dark, heavy gaze on me. I needed to be somewhere where the air doesn't smell like desperation. The elevator jolted to a halt. The doors opened. Winter hit us like a physical blow. The wind on the roof was ferocious, a biting gale that instantly cut through my suit jacket. It was glorious. The rooftop was a sprawling landscape of tar and gravel, dotted with humming HVAC units and vents steaming into the night. Far below, the city was a carpet of electric jewels, indifferent and sprawling. The noise of the party was just a dull thrum beneath our feet, a heartbeat we had escaped. Rachel stepped out into the cold without hesitation. The wind caught the silver fabric of her gown, whipping it around her legs like liquid mercury. She didn't shiver. She walked to the center of the roof, the gravel crunching beneath her expensive soles, and stopped. Then, with a movement of pure, rebellious grace, she reached down and unbuckled her heels. She kicked them away, one, then the other. They tumbled across the tar paper. $4,000 of Italian leather, discarded like trash. "Better," she breathed. She stood barefoot on the icy roof, grounding herself. She turned to me, her hair whipped into a dark halo by the wind. She looked wild, untamed. The perfect, polished supermodel had been scoured away by the cold, leaving something raw and dangerous in her place. I walked toward her. I couldn't help it. The pull was undeniable. I stopped a few feet away, close enough to see the goosebumps rising on her bare arms, close enough to smell the cedar and the cold on her skin. "You're going to freeze," I said. "I'd rather freeze than fake it for one more minute," she countered. Her voice was snatched away by the wind, but her eyes held mine, unflinching. She wasn't looking at the view. She wasn't looking at the skyline. She was looking at me. "Why did you text me?" I asked. The question hung in the freezing air. "Because you're the only one who didn't want anything from me," she said, taking a step closer. The distance between us collapsed. "Everyone downstairs wants the image. You just wanted to see." The proximity turned the simple act of standing into something intimately charged. The wind howled around us, but in the small space between our bodies, the air was thick, heavy with everything we hadn't said in the green room. "I want a lot of things," I admitted, my voice rough. "Good," she whispered. "I'm tired of people who are easily satisfied." We stood on the edge of the world, balancing on the precipice of the new year, watching each other with dangerous intent. The wind up here didn't just blow, it scoured. Below us, the city was a grid of indifferent amber and white. We were suspended in the void above it, caught in the breathless gap between the year that was dying and the one waiting to be born. Rachel wrapped her arms around herself, her bare shoulders pale against the ink-black sky. She didn't look cold, though. She looked elemental. The silver dress whipped around her legs, the fabric snapping in the wind like a flag. But she stood planted on the gravel with a terrifying stillness. She was watching me, with that same intensity she'd had in the green room, searching for something she hadn't found downstairs, among the champagne toasts and the empty compliments. "They're starting the 10-minute warning," she said. Her voice was snatched by the wind, but I heard the texture of it. Low, rough, and stripped of all the polished cadence she used for interviews. "Down there. They're getting their glasses ready. They're preparing their lies." "It's just a tradition," I said, though the words tasted like ash in my mouth. I moved a step closer, instinctively trying to block the wind for her, though I knew she wouldn't accept the shelter. "People like a clean slate." "There's no such thing," she countered, a sharp, bitter edge to her tone. She looked out at the skyline, her profile cut from glass and shadow. "You don't get a clean slate just because the clock moves. You just drag the same mess into a new number." She turned back to me, her eyes dark and unreadable. "You never answered me, back inside, when I asked about the resolutions." I stayed silent, the cold biting at my cheeks. I had hoped she'd forgotten. "I told you I hate them," she continued, taking a step toward me. The gravel crunched loudly under her bare feet. "I told you I just wanted to be real, but you stayed quiet. You just took the picture." She tilted her head, studying me like a complex lighting setup she was trying to decode. "So tell me now, no camera, no audience. What's your resolution then? What does the woman who watches everyone else actually want for herself?" The question hung between us, heavier than the biting air. I could have given her the safe answer. I could have told her I wanted to land the Vogue cover in March. I could have said I wanted to stop working 18-hour days, or that I wanted to travel more, or that I wanted to finally buy a studio with north-facing windows. Those were the answers the photographer would give. Those were the answers that kept the walls up, that kept me safely behind the lens, observing the fire without ever getting burned. But looking at her now, this woman who had just kicked off $4,000 shoes to stand in the freezing wind because she couldn't stand one more minute of being fake, the safe answer felt like a betrayal. It felt like an insult to the raw, jagged honesty she was offering me. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, warning rhythm. I realized then that I didn't want safety. I didn't want the control I had spent my entire career perfecting. I was tired of composing the world. I was tired of the precision, the distance, the way I curated every shadow and highlight to ensure nothing ever touched me. I looked at Rachel, at the dangerous curve of her mouth and the challenge in her eyes, and I knew exactly what I wanted. I wanted the chaos she carried. I wanted to be the subject, not the director. "I don't want a resolution," I said. My voice was steady, but it felt like I was stepping off a ledge. I don't want to improve. I don't want to build. Then what? She whispered. She was close now. I could see the flecks of gold in her dark eyes. What do you want? I took a breath, inhaling the scent of snow and cedar that clung to her. To be undone by you. The words left my mouth and seemed to freeze in the air, absolute and terrifying. Rachel stopped breathing. It wasn't a figure of speech. I watched the air rest in her lungs. Her lips parted slightly, a sharp intake of breath that never finished. Her eyes widened, the pupils blowing out until the iris was just a thin ring of darkness. For the first time all night, maybe for the first time in years, the composure cracked completely. The supermodel vanished. The icon vanished. There was just a woman, stunned into silence, looking at me as if I had just reached into her chest and closed my hand around her heart. I had shifted the gravity. All night, she had been the sun, and I had been the planet orbiting her heat. But with 5 words, I had exposed my throat. I had handed her the weapon. I wasn't observing her anymore. I was surrendering to her. Undone, she repeated, the word barely a ghost of a sound on her lips. She looked at me with a sudden, devastating vulnerability, as if she couldn't decide whether to run or to ruin me. You have no idea what you're asking for. I think I do, I answered, and I didn't look away. I didn't blink. I let her see the hunger I had been hiding behind my aperture ring all night. The wind howled around us, tearing at our clothes. But in the space between our bodies, the silence was absolute. The power dynamic had shattered. I wasn't safe behind my camera anymore. I was standing on the edge of a roof with a woman who could destroy me. And for the first time in my life, I didn't want to save myself. I wanted the fall. She didn't retreat. That was the first shock. When you tell someone you want them to dismantle you, you expect hesitation. You expect the polite recoil of self-preservation, the half-step back that people take when things get too real. Rachel didn't recoil. She advanced. The movement wasn't tentative. It was the sudden, sharp snap of a magnet finally finding its steel. One moment, she was a silhouette against the skyline, a beautiful, distant idea of a woman. And the next, she was a reality that blocked out the rest of the world. The distance between us didn't just shrink. It evaporated, burned away by the sudden, terrifying intent in her eyes. Her hands came up to frame my face. They were freezing, ice cold from the winter air and the metal railing, shocking against the flushed heat of my skin. It wasn't a caress. It was a grip. She held me like she was trying to keep the earth from spinning off its axis. Or maybe she was just trying to steady herself. Her thumbs pressed into my cheekbones, hard, grounding us both in the physical truth of the moment. I stopped breathing. I stopped thinking. The camera, hanging heavy at my hip, was forgotten, a dead weight that no longer mattered. I wasn't the photographer anymore. I was just the woman standing in her way. Then she kissed me. It wasn't a movie kiss. It wasn't the soft, tentative brush of lips you see in the rom-coms right before the credits roll. It was a collision. It was a desperate, starving thing. She tasted of the cold air and the tannic bite of the Malbec she'd been nursing downstairs. But mostly she tasted like relief. It was the taste of a mask shattering. She kissed me with a ferocity that bordered on violence, a release of months of silent observation and suppressed hunger. It wasn't a question. It was an answer to every glance we'd shared across the crowded room. I made a sound, a low, wrecked noise in the back of my throat, and my hands found her waist. The liquid silver dress was cold under my palms, the sequins hard and scratchy, biting into my skin. It was a sharp, tactile contrast to the softness of her mouth. I pulled her closer, needing to eliminate even the suggestion of space between us. I wanted the friction. I wanted the heat. I wanted to feel the frantic, erratic rhythm of her heart hammering against my own ribs, proving that the Ice Queen was just as terrified and alive as I was. Somewhere above us, the sky tore open. The first boom of the midnight fireworks rolled over the city, a sonic concussion that shook the roof beneath our feet. I felt the flash of light against my closed eyelids, red, gold, white, bathing us in a strobe-light chaos. But neither of us looked up. We didn't care about the spectacle. Let the city have its lights. Let the thousands of people downstairs toast to their resolutions and their fresh starts. We were busy burning down the old year. right here. She deepened the kiss, her fingers tangling in my hair, pulling my head back to get better access. It was a claiming. She was marking me. She was taking the photographer, the observer, the invisible woman, and dragging her into the center of the frame. There was no composition here, no rule of thirds, no perfect lighting. There was just the rough, messy, overwhelming heat of her body against mine, and the absolute certainty that I was being undone, exactly as I had asked. We stayed like that while the sky exploded. Two dark shapes fused together on a freezing rooftop, ignoring the celebration of time passing in favor of making time stop. When we finally pulled apart, gasping, our breath mingling in white clouds between us, the fireworks were fading into drifting smoke. My lips felt bruised. My hands were shaking again, but not from nerves. I looked at her, eyes wide and dark and blown, and I knew. The year had turned. The resolution had been set. And I was in so much trouble. The adrenaline of the rooftop didn't fade. It just settled into something heavier, warm and golden, like silt at the bottom of a river. We ended up at a private after-party in a penthouse that cost more than my entire education, but we didn't go inside. We found the balcony. It was quieter here, a sanctuary of stone and iron suspended above the sleeping city. The wind had died down, or maybe we were just numb to it now, insulated by the heat that still radiated between us. We sat on a low, cushioned bench, shoulders pressed together, sharing a single glass of stolen champagne that neither of us really drank. Inside, through the glass doors, I could see the silhouettes of the hangers-on, the people who refused to let the night end because they were afraid of the morning. But out here, in the cold, clear air, the morning felt inevitable. Rachel had pulled her hair back into a messy knot, strands escaping to frame a face that looked softer in the pre-dawn gray. She wasn't the supermodel anymore. She wasn't even the fugitive from the roof. She was just Rachel. She held the stem of the glass, twisting it idly, watching the bubbles rise and die. "You know what happens tomorrow," she said quietly. It wasn't a question. The emails start, the agents call, the diet starts again. I have a fitting in Milan on Tuesday. She looked at me, her eyes dark and serious, stripping away the romance of the rooftop to show me the machinery underneath. The gloss comes back. The armor goes back on. "I don't care about the gloss," I said. And for the first time in my career, I meant it. I didn't want the perfect lighting. I wanted this, the smudge of mascara under her eye, the way her voice cracked with fatigue, the shivering reality of her body pressed against mine for warmth. "It's messy," she warned, leaning her head back against the cushion, her gaze fixed on the fading stars. "My life isn't an editorial spread. It's lonely hotel rooms and people who only love you when the light hits you right. It's panic attacks in bathrooms and eating dinner alone in cities where everyone knows your face but nobody knows your name. It's ugly sometimes." She turned her head on the cushion to look at me, her expression unflinching. "You said you wanted to be undone. The ugly parts are what do the undoing. It's not the kiss that ruins you. It's the Tuesday morning when I'm crying over a missed flight and you have to decide if you're still watching or if you're staying." I reached out and took her hand. Her fingers were warmer now, threading through mine with a familiarity that felt earned, like we'd been doing this for years instead of hours. The contact was grounding, a tether in the spinning world. "I'm not looking for a picture, Rachel. I'm done with pictures. I want the Tuesday morning." She squeezed my hand, a pressure that anchored me to the bench, to the balcony, to her. A slow, tired smile touched her lips, more beautiful than any cover smile she'd ever sold. "Good," she whispered, "because I'm done being an image." We sat in silence as the sky began to bruise with purple and gold. The frantic energy of the gala, the desperate hunger of the rooftop kiss. It all felt distant now. This was the reality. The quiet, terrifying intimacy of sitting next to someone and realizing you aren't ready to leave. The resolution I'd whispered on the roof wasn't a pickup line. It was a prophecy. I looked at her profile against the rising sun, the sharp, beautiful architecture of a woman who had let me in, and I felt the walls of my safe, observational life crumbling. I wasn't just watching the story anymore. I was in it. And as the first true light of the new year hit the skyline, painting the city in cold, honest gray, I knew there was no going back to the safety of the lens. The car ride home was silent, but the air was different. I wasn't the photographer in the passenger seat anymore. I was the partner. I looked over at Rachel, asleep against the cool window, her mouth slightly open, completely unguarded. No pose, no filter, just the realest thing I'd ever seen. If you want to know what happens when you finally put the camera down and let yourself be seen, subscribe. Tell me in the comments, what mask are you ready to drop this year? Because trust me, the view is better without it.